What if the knight in shining armor, our most enduring symbol of heroism, was actually the villain of the Middle Ages? Picture the scene. A grand tournament field, buzzing with the roar of a hopeful crowd. Colorful banners snap in the breeze, representing the great houses of the realm. Two riders, encased in polished steel, thunder towards each other. Lances shatter against shields in a spray of splintered wood, all for the honor of a fair lady who watches from a silk-draped pavilion. This is the knight of the storybooks, a knight of King Arthur, of Ivanhoe, of our collective imagination. This is the image we all know and cherish. But it is not the truth. Our journey tonight goes beyond the fairy tale. We will peel back the layers of romantic legend to find the real, historical figure underneath. If you enjoy having your view of the past challenged, consider leaving a gentle like on the video. It helps our small channel find others who appreciate these quiet explorations. We'd also love to hear your first thoughts in the comments below. What one word best describes your image of a knight before we begin? Welcome to Sleeping Scribe. Here, we believe that history is the most relaxing story of all. It is a place for calming tales that help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we travel back to the Middle Ages to uncover the true story of the knight, the real story behind the myth. But to understand the real knight, we must first set aside these familiar tales of quests and chivalry. Our story does not begin in a grand castle or a glittering royal court. It begins in a time of chaos. It begins with fire and fear, and with a desperate need for a new kind of warrior. Our story begins in an age of endings. The great engine of the Roman Empire had long since fallen silent. Its successor, the sprawling Carolingian Empire forged by Charlemagne, had also fractured and collapsed by the 9th century. Central authority dissolved like mist in the morning sun. The grand dream of a united Christendom, a new Rome, was dead. What remained was a patchwork of petty kingdoms, duchies, and counties. These small realms were fragile, they were weak, and they were terrified. From every direction, new threats emerged to prey on the carcass of the old empire. From the north came the Vikings. Their longships sliced through the coastal waters and up the great rivers, striking without warning. They were masters of the lightning raid, leaving behind only smoke, death, and terror. From the east thundered the Magyars. These nomadic horsemen swept across the plains of Central Europe, their arrows falling like deadly rain. They were unstoppable on the open field, a storm of hoof and horn. And from the south, across the Mediterranean, came Saracen pirates. They plagued the coastlines of Italy and France, enslaving populations and crippling trade. Europe was a land under siege. The old ways of fighting were no longer enough. The traditional Frankish armies, composed largely of infantry-free men, could not respond quickly enough to these sudden, brutal raids. How could a marching army intercept a Viking longship that could appear anywhere at any time? How could foot soldiers stand against the whirlwind cavalry of the Magyars? A new solution was needed, a new kind of defense, a new kind of soldier. The answer was found not in numbers, but in speed and shock. The answer was the warrior on horseback. This was not an entirely new idea. The Carolingians themselves had relied on elite mounted soldiers, a class of warriors they called the cavallari. But it was a key piece of technology, introduced to Europe some centuries before, that truly unlocked the potential of the mounted warrior. That technology was the stirrup. It seemed so simple, a loop of metal for a rider's foot. Yet it was a revolution. The stirrup acted as a stabilizing platform. It anchored the rider to his horse. Before the stirrup, a horseman could slash with a sword or throw a spear, but the force of a direct forward thrust would likely send him tumbling from his saddle. With stirrups, a rider could stand firm against the impact. He could brace himself and couple his own weight and the entire momentum of his charging warhorse into the point of a single weapon. That weapon was the lance. The couched lance charge, made possible by the stirrup, was the medieval equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. A line of charging horsemen became an irresistible force, a wall of iron-tipped spears that could shatter any infantry formation. This was the military reality that shaped the dawning age. To defend a territory, a lord needed soldiers who could move fast. He needed soldiers who could hit hard. He needed warriors on horseback. And so, local lords and magnates began to surround themselves with retinues of these specialized fighters. Men whose entire purpose was to live in the saddle and fight with the lance. But who were these first mounted warriors? Were they the sons of dukes and counts? Were they noblemen, fighting for honor and glory? Far from it. The early Latin term for one of these men was simply Miles. The word meant soldier, nothing more. It carried no noble connotation, no hint of high status. In fact, many of these first knights were of humble, even unfree origin. They were not chosen for their bloodline. They were chosen for their skill, their strength, and their brutality. A lord did not care if a warrior's father was a peasant or a blacksmith. He cared only if that man could sit a horse and kill his enemies. These were professional soldiers in a world that desperately needed them. Their value was purely military. They were a tool, a weapon, forged in the fires of a chaotic and violent age. Their relationship with their lord was not based on a lofty ideal of loyalty. It was a pragmatic contract. The lord provided the food, the shelter, and the immensely expensive equipment. In return, the warrior provided his lance. This was the birth of the knight. Not a paladin or a hero from a song, but a tough professional fighting man, a hired soldier on horseback, born from the desperate military needs of a collapsing world. His armor was not yet shining, and his only code was survival. This new warrior, the Miles, did not exist in a vacuum. His very presence on the landscape began to reshape society around him, forging a new kind of world. This was the world we now call feudal. The system grew from a simple, practical problem. How does a lord pay for these elite mounted soldiers? The cost of outfitting and maintaining even one knight was astronomical. First, there was the warhorse, the destrier. This was not a simple riding horse. It was a massive, powerful animal, bred and trained for the shock of combat. A single destrier could cost as much as a small farm. It was a luxury item, a piece of high-tech military hardware. Then came the armor. In this early period, it was typically a hauberk of chainmail, tens of thousands of tiny, interlinked iron rings, painstakingly riveted together. It was flexible and effective, but also incredibly labor-intensive and expensive to produce. Add to this a helmet, a strong wooden shield, a long-bladed sword, and the essential lance. The total investment was staggering. It was far beyond the reach of any common man. Only a wealthy lord could afford to equip a force of such warriors. And so, a transactional relationship formed, a bond of mutual need. The lord provided the gear, and the knight provided the violence. This relationship was formalized through an oath. This was the ceremony of vassalage. A knight would kneel before a lord, place his hands in his, and swear an oath of fealty or faithfulness. He promised to be his lord's man, to fight for him, to defend his lands. In return, the lord promised to protect and provide for his vassal. Initially, this provision was simple. The knight would live in the lord's hall, eating at his table, sleeping under his roof. He was part of the lord's household, a permanent member of his military retinue. But this arrangement had its limits. As lords gathered more and more knights, it became impractical to house them all. A new form of payment was needed. The solution was land. Instead of just food and lodging, a lord would grant his knight a plot of land. This grant was known as a fief. From this land, the knight was expected to draw enough income to support himself, his family, his horses, and his equipment. This changed everything. The knight was no longer just a household soldier. He was a landholder. He had his own small domain to manage. This is where the iconic image of the castle comes from. But we should not picture the great stone fortresses of the later Middle Ages. The first castles were much humbler. They were known as motte and bailey castles. A motte was a large, man-made earthen mound. On top of it, a wooden tower was built. At the foot of the mound was a courtyard, the bailey, enclosed by a wooden palisade and a ditch. These were not palaces. They were functional, defensive structures. They were centers of local power, a place for the knight to live, and a base from which he could project his military force. And what was the knight's primary function from this new base? Was it to ride out on noble quests? To rescue damsels in distress? No. His function was intensely local and deeply practical. He was his lord's enforcer. He collected taxes and tolls from the peasants living on the fief. He presided over local disputes. He was the law, enforced at the point of a sword. His military duties were also local. He did not fight dragons or giants. He fought his lord's neighbors. The Middle Ages were rife with petty, private wars between local lords over boundaries, inheritances, and insults. The knight was the key piece in this constant, violent chess game. His primary role was to defend his lord's territory from the knight in the next valley, and to raid that knight's lands in return. This created a new social class. The knightly class was distinct from the old aristocracy, the descendants of Roman senators or Germanic chieftains. This was a new aristocracy, a nobility of the sword. One's place in this class was not necessarily determined by birth. A man of humble origins could, through exceptional military service, be granted a fief and become a knight. His sons would inherit that status, and a new knightly family would be born. This entire structure was held together by a web of obligations. The core of the vassal's oath was knight service. This was the specific, often written, requirement for the knight to provide military aid to his lord. This was not a vague promise. It was often a strict contract. A knight owed his lord a set number of days of military service per year, typically 40. The feudal world, therefore, was not built on dreams of Camelot. It was a pragmatic system, a pyramid of power built upon land and violence. The knight was its foundation, a land-holding warrior whose primary job was to enforce his master's will upon the local population and to wage war against his master's rivals. The world forged by these new warriors was a violent one. With the knight established as the dominant force of local power, a new kind of problem emerged. Their violence was not easily contained. The very system of feudalism, with its patchwork of local lords and competing claims, encouraged conflict. Private warfare was not the exception. It was the norm. Knights, whose entire training and social purpose revolved around combat, were restless and aggressive. Feuds between noble families could last for generations, fueled by a constant cycle of raids, ambushes, and petty battles. This endemic violence did not just affect the knights themselves. It spilled out and washed over the entire countryside, devastating the lives of those who could not fight back. The people who suffered most were the common folk, the peasants, the merchants, the clergy. They were the primary victims of this warrior class, whose feuds destroyed crops, burned villages, and disrupted all semblance of normal life. In this time of chaos, one institution tried to stand against the tide: the church. Clergymen and monks saw the destruction firsthand. They saw their own monasteries plundered by rapacious knights, their flocks terrorized. They recognized that the warrior class they had, in some ways, helped create, was now out of control. And so, beginning in the late 10th century, a powerful movement began to swell from within the church. It was an attempt to civilize the knight, to tame his violent impulses through the power of God. This movement took two primary forms. The first was called the Peace of God. It began with a series of church councils, like the one held at Cherou in the year 989. Here, bishops and abbots gathered to proclaim a sacred peace. The peace of God was not an attempt to ban war altogether. That was seen as impossible. Instead, it was an attempt to grant immunity to non-combatants. The church declared that certain people were under God's special protection. Clergy, monks, and nuns were not to be attacked. Peasants, the unarmed poor, were to be left alone. Their tools, their crops, and their animals were to be spared. Merchants traveling on the roads were also given protection. The movement sought to create zones of peace, to declare whole categories of people off limits to the violence of the knightly class. The very existence of this movement tells us everything we need to know about the behavior of the average knight. One does not need to formally forbid a hero from robbing priests and killing farmers. The second part of the movement was the truce of God. If the peace of God protected people, the truce of God protected time. Again, accepting that they could not stop warfare, the church tried to place it on a schedule. The truce of God prohibited any and all fighting on certain holy days of the week and seasons of the year. Violence was forbidden on Sunday, the day of the Lord's resurrection. It was later extended to include Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, in honor of the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the entombment. Major religious seasons were also declared sacred times of peace. All warfare was to cease during Lent, the period of fasting before Easter, and during Advent, the season leading up to Christmas. The church's goal was to severely limit the number of days in the year when knights could legally kill each other. And how did the church enforce these rules? It wielded its most powerful spiritual weapon: excommunication. A knight who violated the peace or the truce of God could be cast out of the church. He would be denied the sacraments, and his soul would be condemned to eternal damnation. It was a terrifying prospect for the people of a deeply religious age. But did it work? The results were limited. The movements had some success in some regions, for some periods of time. But the deeply ingrained violence of the warrior class was not so easily erased. The chronicles of the era, written by monks, are filled with bitter complaints. They describe knights who who swore the oath of peace on a holy relic one day, only to plunder a monastery or burn a village the next. The authority of the church was great, but the lure of land, loot, and vengeance was often greater. The peace and truce of God were noble, desperate experiments, but their limited success revealed a hard truth. The knightly class was a force of controlled chaos at best, and a plague of brutal thugs at worst. The church had tried to rein in their violence at home. It had failed. And so, a new, far more ambitious idea began to take shape. If you cannot stop the violence, perhaps you can redirect it. Perhaps you can export it. By the end of the 11th century, Europe's warrior class was a problem. There were too many knights, all competing for a limited amount of land. Younger sons of noble families, with no inheritance to look forward to, formed restless, dangerous bands of armed men. The church, as attempts to curb their violence with the peace and truce of God, had proven to be a leaky dam against a raging river. The destructive energy of the knights needed an outlet. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II provided one. At the Council of Clermont in central France, he delivered one of the most influential speeches in human history. He spoke to a vast crowd of bishops, abbots, lords, and knights. He spoke of the plight of Christians in the East. He described the suffering of pilgrims and the desecration of holy sites in Jerusalem under the rule of the Seljuk Turks. He called upon the warriors of Christendom to stop fighting each other, to end their pointless, sinful private wars. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians, he urged. He offered them a new target for their aggression, an enemy abroad. But this was not just a call to arms. It was a brilliant political and social maneuver. It was a solution to the knight problem. Pope Urban was reframing the very nature of their violent profession. He was offering these warriors a holy cause, a way to use their deadly skills in the service of God. And he offered them powerful incentives. The first was spiritual. To any man who took the cross and journeyed to fight in the Holy Land, Urban offered a plenary indulgence. This was an unprecedented promise. It meant the complete remission of all sins. For a knight whose life was spent in acts of violence that the church condemned, this was an astonishing offer. A chance to wash their souls clean through one great act of sanctified warfare. The second incentive was material. The Pope spoke of the East as a land of fabulous wealth, flowing with milk and honey. For knights with little land or prospects at home, this was an irresistible lure. The crusade was an opportunity to win new lands, to seize fabulous riches, to carve out new kingdoms for themselves. It was a perfect fusion of piety and greed. And so, the idea of the crusade caught fire. It swept across Europe with incredible speed. Preachers carried the message to every corner of the land, and warriors flocked to take the cross. But we should not imagine the First Crusade as a single, unified army marching under one king or emperor. It was far more chaotic than that. It was a collection of several great armies, each led by a powerful lord and his personal retinue of knights. Men from France, from Germany, from Norman Italy, all heading east with their own ambitions, united only by a common and often vague goal. In the crucible of this movement, a new concept was born, the Miles Christi, the soldier of Christ. For the first time, the knight's brutal profession was not just excused or tolerated by the church, it was sanctified. Killing was no longer a sin if the person you killed was an enemy of Christ. Violence could be an act of piety. This was the beginning of the chivalric ideal, the first attempt to fuse the warrior and the Christian into a single figure. But the reality of this holy enterprise was far from the noble ideal. As the crusading bands made their way east, their ingrained brutality came with them. In the Rhineland, some crusaders unleashed horrific pogroms against Jewish communities, murdering thousands of innocent men, women, and children in a wave of religious hysteria and greed. And when the main armies finally reached their goal in the year 1099, the result was a bloodbath. After a long siege, the Crusaders stormed the city of Jerusalem. What followed was a brutal, indiscriminate sack of the city. Eyewitness accounts from the Crusaders themselves describe their soldiers wading through blood up to their ankles. They slaughtered Muslims and Jews, soldiers and civilians, without distinction, in a frenzy of violence that shocked even the standards of the age. The First Crusade was, in one sense, a military success, but it also revealed the terrifying truth of the Miles Christi. It showed what happened when the brutal, rapacious violence of the European knight was unleashed upon the world, blessed by a holy cause. The knight's journey began not in a noble court, but in the chaos of a fallen empire. As we've seen, his purpose was forged in violence, both as a local enforcer and a holy warrior. I wonder, does knowing their raw origins change how you see their later stories? Let us know your thoughts as we continue our journey. And so, we left the knight on the shores of the Holy Land. He was a newly sanctified warrior, the Miles Christi, his violent profession now blessed by a holy cause. But behind this newfound piety lay a simple, brutal truth. The knight was a weapon, forged in the chaos of a fallen empire, and his primary purpose was violence. But violence is a trade, and like any trade, it has its expenses. The romantic tales of knights serving for honor alone, of embarking on quests with no thought for reward, are among the most persistent parts of the myth. They are also among the most untrue. To be a knight was not just a social status, it was a business. A very, very expensive business. And the true story of a knight is found not just in his battles, but in his accounting. The life of a knight was built on a foundation of iron and horseflesh, and both came at a staggering price. Let us, for a moment, set aside the sword and lance and pick up a ledger. Let us count the cost of being a medieval warrior. The single greatest expense was the warhorse. This was the knight's primary weapon system, the engine of his power. We are not talking about a simple riding horse or a plodding farm animal. We are talking about a destrier, a beast bred for size, strength, and courage. It had to be strong enough to carry a man encased in metal, and aggressive enough to charge into the terrifying chaos of a battle. Training such an animal was a long and specialized process. Acquiring one was a mark of incredible wealth. How much did a good destrier cost? Contemporary records give us some shocking comparisons. A single warhorse could be worth the equivalent of 20 to 30 peasant oxen. It could cost as much as a small farm, complete with its buildings and fields. A knight who lost his horse in battle had not just lost his transportation. He had lost a fortune. He had lost the very tool of his trade. But one horse was never enough. A knight on campaign required a small stable of animals. He needed his destrier for the battle itself, but it was too valuable and aggressive to be used for simple travel. For the long marches, he would ride a calmer, more comfortable horse called a palfrey. Then he needed pack horses. These were the humble, sturdy animals required to carry the immense amount of baggage a knight needed. His armor, his weapons, his tents, his food, and the supplies for his staff. That's right, his staff. A knight did not travel alone. He was the head of a small mobile enterprise. At the very least, he required a squire, a young man, often a nobleman in training, who served as his personal assistant. The squire cleaned his armor, maintained his weapons, and armed him for battle. He was a valet, an apprentice, and a comrade in arms. Beyond the squire, a knight would need grooms to care for his precious horses. He might need servants to cook and maintain his camp. All of these people needed to be fed, equipped, and sometimes paid. And then there was the armor, the iconic suit of steel. In the early period we have discussed, this was a hauberk of chainmail. But as the centuries wore on and weapons grew more powerful, armor evolved to counter them. Mail gave way to reinforced coats of plates, and eventually to the magnificent, all-encompassing carapace of full-plate armor. This was the pinnacle of personal defensive technology. Each suit was a masterpiece of metallurgy and articulation, custom fitted to its owner. It was the medieval equivalent of a fighter jet, and it had a comparable price tag. A fine suit of plate armor, crafted in a master workshop in Milan or Augsburg, could cost as much as the entire annual income of a very wealthy merchant. It was a king's ransom in articulated steel. Finally, we come to the weapons themselves. While a simple lance or shield might be relatively inexpensive, a knight's sword was a different matter. A high-quality sword, with a blade forged from properly tempered steel, was a specialized and highly prized object. Swords from famous smiths in cities like Zolingen or Passau were luxury items, renowned for their sharpness, flexibility, and strength. They were status symbols as much as they were weapons. When you add all of these costs together, a clear picture emerges. Knighthood was not a calling that just any man could answer. It was an exclusive profession, protected by an enormous economic barrier. You couldn't become a knight simply by being brave. You had to be rich, or you had to find a rich lord willing to pay your astronomical startup costs. This financial reality is what cemented the knights as a landed, aristocratic class. The price of steel ensured that the world of the warrior would be a world of the wealthy. With such immense overheads, a knight needed reliable streams of income. The rents from his fief provided a baseline, but they were rarely enough to fund the lavish costs of war and status. A knight needed profit, and the most direct path to profit was the practice of war itself. War was not just about politics or honor. It was an economic activity, and the most common form of warfare in the Middle Ages was designed for maximum financial gain. It was a tactic known by a French name, the chevauchée. The word literally means a horse charge or promenade, but its reality was anything but a pleasant ride. A chevauchée was a systematic, destructive raid deep into enemy territory. It was the standard military tactic for much of the late Middle Ages, used to devastating effect, most famously by the English during the 100 Years' War against France. The strategic goal of a chevauchée was twofold. First, it was meant to destroy the enemy king's economic base. You did not seek to capture his castles or fight his main army. Instead, you sought to ruin him by ruining his lands. You would burn his subjects' crops in the fields. You would destroy their mills and granaries. You would slaughter their livestock. You would leave a trail of devastation, crippling the king's ability to collect taxes and raise new armies. It was economic warfare in its most brutal form. The second goal was to demoralize the population. A king who could not protect his own people from such raids looked weak and ineffective. The chevauqué was a terror tactic, a message written in fire and blood. But for the individual knight and the common soldier, the chevauqué had a much simpler and more personal purpose. It was a government-sanctioned, legally approved opportunity for plunder. As the army moved through the countryside, it stripped the land bare. Anything of value was taken. Livestock was herded away to be sold or slaughtered for food. Grain was seized from storehouses. Church altars were stripped of their silver candlesticks and golden chalices. The homes of merchants and peasants were ransacked for money, cloth, and anything else that could be carried. It was a red harvest, a violent reaping of an enemy's wealth. The chroniclers of the age, men like Jean Froissart, describe these expeditions in chilling, matter-of-fact detail. He writes of armies marching through France, leaving behind a burned and empty wasteland, and he does so with the detached air of a man describing a normal, everyday occurrence. Because it was. This practice stands in stark opposition to every romantic ideal of chivalry. The knight's code, as we imagine it, was to protect the weak, to defend the helpless. Yet here, in the most common form of medieval warfare, the knight's primary activity was the systematic terrorizing of the weak. His goal was to inflict suffering on the unarmed peasantry. There was no honor in it. There was only profit. The smoke rising from a burning village was not a tragedy to the passing knight. It was the smell of a successful business trip. The chevauqué reveals a fundamental truth of the age. War was the knight's trade, and plunder was his salary. The plunder of goods and supplies was a vital part of the war economy. But the real prize on a medieval battlefield was not an object. It was a person. Specifically, it was a person of high birth. Capturing an enemy lord or knight was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. This simple fact created a sophisticated and highly lucrative economy of ransom that governed the very nature of combat. On the battlefield, a stark class divide determined who lived and who died. The common soldier, the footman, or the archer was largely worthless. If he was captured, he was often killed on the spot to save the trouble and expense of feeding him. He was not part of the club. He had no ransom value. But a captured nobleman, a baron, a count, or a wealthy knight was a golden goose. He was an asset to be protected and carefully managed. His life had a literal price tag. The most famous example of this system in action came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. In a stunning victory, the English forces not only defeated the French army, but they also captured the King of France himself, John II. His ransom was set at an almost unbelievable 3 million gold crowns. It was a sum so vast, it nearly bankrupted the French kingdom. It was a national catastrophe for France, but an unimaginable windfall for the English victors. On a smaller scale, this same logic applied to every knight on the field. A successful military career was not necessarily measured in victories, but in profitable captives. Consider the famous 14th century French knight, Bertrand du Guesclin. He was a celebrated commander, but he was also captured and ransomed multiple times during his career. The ransoms paid for his release simply became a business expense, while the ransoms he collected from his own captives funded his campaigns. His entire career was financed by this brutal marketplace of human lives. This economy became so sophisticated that it developed its own legal and financial instruments. Knights on the battlefield would often form small syndicates or partnerships. They would agree beforehand to pool their efforts to capture a specific high-value target, a rich duke or earl on the opposing side. If they succeeded, they would share the ransom proceeds according to their contract. A formal ransom contract would be drawn up, detailing the amount, the payment schedule, and the collateral. A captured noble might have to arrange for his relatives to stand as hostages until the full amount was paid. It was a cold, calculated business. Even the captured knight's equipment was part of the prize. His expensive armor, his destrier, and his weapons were claimed by his captor as spoils of war. This system had a profound effect on how knights fought each other. It actively incentivized capturing, not killing, an opponent of the same social class. It was considered poor form and bad business to kill a noble opponent who was trying to surrender. The goal was to unhorse him, surround him, and accept his surrender. His capture was far more glorious and infinitely more profitable than his death. The battlefield was therefore a strange and cynical marketplace. It was a place of deadly violence, but also of careful calculation. For the knightly class, it was a brutal but rational game, where the lives of their own kind were the highest valued commodity. The feudal system was built on an ideal of loyalty. A knight swore an oath of fealty to his lord, promising service in exchange for land. But what happened when the wars ended, even temporarily? What happened to these professional soldiers when there was no one to fight? For many knights, loyalty to a lord was a distant second to their primary motivation: profit. When the business of feudal war dried up, they simply found new customers. The line between a loyal knight and a simple mercenary was often blurry, and sometimes it vanished entirely. This reality became starkly clear in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially during the lulls in the 100 Years' War. When truces were signed, thousands of professional soldiers, from knights and squires down to common archers and men-at-arms, were suddenly unemployed. They were trained for nothing but war, living in a foreign land, with no income and no desire to go home. So they formed their own armies. They were known as free companies. These were, in essence, mercenary corporations. They were military brotherhoods, bound together not by an oath to a king, but by a contract to a captain. They were open for business. These companies had colorful and intimidating names: the Great Company, the Company of the Star, or the infamous White Company, led for a time by an English knight named Sir John Hawkwood. Hawkwood became one of the most powerful and feared military contractors in Italy, selling the services of his company to popes and princes, fighting for Florence one year and against them the next. He was a military entrepreneur. The free companies were a pan-European phenomenon. Their ranks were filled with English archers, Gascon crossbowmen, German men-at-arms, and French knights. They were professionals who went where the money was. They sold their services to anyone who could pay. Cities, dukes, and even the Pope himself hired these companies to fight their battles for them. They were effective, experienced, and utterly ruthless. But what did they do when there were no contracts to be had? When no one was paying for their services? They did not simply disband. They lived off the land. This meant engaging in large-scale, organized banditry. They would seize a town or a region and terrorize it, demanding massive payments in exchange for not burning it to the ground. This was a protection racket on a terrifying scale. Their existence completely undermines the romantic notion of the loyal, chivalrous knight. For the men in the free companies, loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold. Honor was a luxury they could not afford. Their only true allegiance was to their captain and to their next paycheck. The great kings and powers of Europe struggled to control these mercenary bands. They were a force of anarchy, a monster of their own creation. Armies of unemployed warriors with no master, roaming the continent, selling their swords to the highest bidder. This reveals the mercenary heart that beat beneath the steel breastplate of many a knight. He was a professional, and when his lord couldn't pay him, he would find someone who could. The ideals of feudal loyalty were often no match for the simple, practical demands of business. The knight's life was a business, with steel as its capital and war as its trade. This economic reality often mattered far more than any oath. As we continue, we'll examine the famous code that was meant to temper this warrior. The beautiful lie of chivalry. Did it ever truly work? Stay with us as the story unfolds. We have seen the knight as a warrior, born of chaos. We have seen him as a businessman, his trade conducted in steel and plunder. His world was one of pragmatic violence, political maneuvering, and ruthless economics. This historical reality seems a world away from the stories we know. The tales of noble heroes, of shining armor and unwavering moral codes. So where did that idea come from? If the historical knight was so often a brutal enforcer and a pragmatic mercenary, who invented the knight of our dreams? The answer is not found on the battlefield, but on the pages of a book. The code we call chivalry was not born of war. It was born of poetry. The idea of chivalry, as we know it, was a literary invention. It was a beautiful lie, crafted not by soldiers, but by poets in the refined and cultured courts of the 12th century France. This was a time of great change. After centuries of chaos, parts of Europe were becoming wealthier, more stable, and more sophisticated. In regions like Aquitaine and Champagne, powerful noble courts became centers of a vibrant new culture. And the undisputed star of this new culture was the powerful and intelligent Eleanor of Aquitaine, first Queen of France and later Queen of England. She and her daughters were immense patrons of the arts, encouraging a new kind of storytelling. These courts were hungry for entertainment, and a new generation of writers and poets rose to meet the demand. They began writing not in the formal Latin of the church, but in the vernacular, the common language of the people. Their stories were meant to be read aloud, to delight the lords and ladies of the court. The greatest of these poets was a man named Chrétien de Troyes. It was he, more than any other single person, who invented the chivalric hero. He took the rough figure of the knight, the miles we have come to know, and he reimagined him. He gave him new motivations, new adventures, and a new, more sensitive soul. Chrétien de Troyes gave us Lancelot, the greatest knight in the world, torn between his loyalty to his king and his forbidden love for Queen Guinevere. He gave us the story of the Grail, turning the knight's quest from a search for land or loot into a mystical search for spiritual transcendence. This was a radical departure from the heroic tales that had come before. An older poem like the Song of Roland celebrated martial prowess and loyalty to one's his lord and God, its hero. Roland was a great warrior, but not a complex courtly gentleman. The new stories introduced a new set of values, a code of conduct for the perfect knight. This was the code of chivalry. It was built on several key pillars. The first was prowess, or prowess. A knight must be a supreme warrior, strong, brave, and skilled in combat. This was the foundation of his identity. Next came loyauté, or loyalty. This was a fierce faithfulness to one's lord, one's promises, and one's God. Then there was largesse, or generosity. A good knight was expected to be open-handed with his wealth, rewarding his followers and giving gifts freely. A revolutionary new concept was courtoisie, or courtesy. This was the knight's behavior outside of battle. It meant being polite, refined, well-spoken, and particularly respectful and attentive to high-born ladies. This idea of courtly love, where a knight performs great deeds in the name of a lady, was a central theme of these new romances. Finally, there was franchise, a sort of frankness or nobility of spirit. It was the idea that a knight should be a free and sincere man, true to his own noble character. But what was the purpose of these stories and this elaborate code? They were certainly meant as entertainment, but they were also prescriptive. They were a form of propaganda for a better kind of nobleman. This literature was created to provide a behavioral model for a rough and violent aristocracy. It was an attempt to civilize them, to sand down their rough edges. It told them, this is how a true knight should act. Be less like the brutish warrior your grandfather was, and more like the noble Lancelot. But we must never mistake the prescription for the reality. The gap between the knight on the page and the knight in the field was immense. The verses described a better man, a perfect ideal. The historical chronicles, as we have seen, described a far more complex and violent truth. Chivalry was, from its very beginning, more of an aspiration than a reality. It was a beautiful dream of what a knight could be. If chivalry was the dream, the medieval battlefield was the brutal awakening. Here, in the mud and the blood, the beautiful ideals of the poets were tested, and they almost always failed. The romantic image of a battle is one of noble knights seeking out their equals for a series of honorable, one-on-one duels. The reality was nothing of the sort. The main cavalry engagement, known as the mêlée, was a chaotic, terrifying, and utterly confusing brawl. It was a crush of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of heavily armed men and panicked horses, crashing together in a single frenzied mass. There was no room for elegant swordsmanship or polite challenges. It was a desperate struggle for survival, where a knight was just as likely to be crushed by a falling horse or stabbed from behind as he was to be engaged in a noble duel. In this chaos, pragmatic and effective tactics always trumped honorable ones. Perhaps the most common unchivalrous tactic was the deliberate targeting of an opponent's horse. According to the ideals of the code, this was poor form. A knight's duel was meant to be between the men, not the animals. But in reality, killing or maiming an enemy's horse was a brutally effective strategy. A knight on foot was a knight in trouble. He was slow, vulnerable, and much easier to kill or capture. To disable a knight's destrier was to disable the knight. It was a dirty trick, and everyone used it. Another fatal blow to the chivalric ideal came from the rise of common soldiers. The code of chivalry and the ransom economy that supported it was a system for nobles. It was a club with exclusive membership. The growing armies of low-born infantrymen, the archers and the pikemen, were not members of this club. They had no stake in the ransom system. Their job was not to capture knights, but to kill them. They had no interest in honorable combat. Their interest lay in neutralizing the most dangerous threat on the battlefield as efficiently as possible. This was demonstrated with shocking clarity at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. An army of French knights, the flower of French nobility, charged a line of humble Flemish pikemen from the merchant cities of Flanders. The knights expected the commoners to break and run. Instead, the pikemen stood their ground in a disciplined formation, a forest of sharpened steel points. The French cavalry charge was stopped dead, and the knights were pulled from their horses and systematically slaughtered by the commoners they so despised. Chivalry offered no protection against a determined infantryman with a sharp stick. The so-called rules of chivalry, when they were followed at all, generally only applied between knights of roughly equal social standing. A great duke might grant mercy to a captured count. He would feel no such obligation to a low-ranking man-at-arms. Even tactics of deception, like a feigned retreat to lure an enemy into an ambush, were seen as dishonorable. But they were also incredibly effective and were used throughout the period. Victory was always more important than style points. We must also not confuse the reality of the battlefield with the highly ritualized judicial duel. This ordeal by combat was a rare legal event, a way of settling a dispute before God. It was not the norm of medieval warfare. The code of chivalry simply could not survive contact with the enemy. In the desperate reality of combat, where life and death were decided in seconds, pragmatism, brutality, and a simple will to survive were the only rules that truly mattered. The code of chivalry failed in the chaos of battle between knights. But its greatest and most tragic failure was in how it was applied, or not applied, to the vast majority of the population, the common people. At the heart of the chivalric ideal was the duty to protect the weak, to defend the church, and to show mercy. Yet the historical record shows that this was the rule most consistently and brutally broken. Chivalry was a class-based code. It was a set of rules for how nobles should treat other nobles. It was not a universal system of ethics. Its protections rarely, if ever, extended to those they considered beneath them: the peasant, the merchant, the artisan. They were simply the backdrop to the great trauma of the nobility, and their suffering was often seen as irrelevant. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Albigensian Crusade, a series of horrific wars in the early 13th century. This was not a war against an external enemy. This was a war of French knights from the north against the people of southern France, who were accused of heresy. The warfare waged by the crusading knights was marked by a level of brutality that shocked even the violent standards of the time. They fought not just against local lords, but against entire communities, viewing men, women, and children as part of the heretical enemy. The most infamous event of this crusade came in the year 1209 at the town of Béziers. When the Crusaders stormed the city walls, they began an indiscriminate massacre of the inhabitants. The papal legate in charge of the crusading army was allegedly asked by a soldier how they should tell the true Catholics from the heretics. His supposed reply has echoed through history as a chilling summary of the crusading mindset. Kill them all. God will know his own. Whether the words were actually spoken is debated by historians, but the massacre itself was real. Thousands were slaughtered without mercy by knights who saw themselves as soldiers of Christ enacting God's will. This was not an isolated incident. When the peasants of France rose up in a desperate revolt known as the Jacquerie in 1358, protesting the ravages of war and taxation, the reaction from the knightly class was swift and merciless. The nobles banded together and crushed the rebellion with sickening cruelty. They slaughtered the peasant rebels with no thought of quarter or mercy. To the knights, these were not people to be protected. They were livestock who had gotten out of their pen. We have already seen the practice of the chevauquée, the systematic destruction of the countryside for profit. This routine tactic was a direct, institutionalized violation of the chivalric duty to protect non-combatants. This reveals the deep hypocrisy at the heart of the chivalric age. A knight could piously pray in a chapel in the morning, listening to a sermon about protecting the weak. And in the afternoon, he could lead his men to burn the villages of those same weak people, believing that he was doing nothing wrong. Chivalry did not seek to break down the rigid class structure of the Middle Ages. It reinforced it. It was a code that defined the nobility as a separate and superior species. And in doing so, it justified their often brutal treatment of everyone else. Sometimes, a single event can illuminate an entire era, a moment where all the theories and ideals are put to the ultimate test. For the code of chivalry, that moment may well have been a wet, muddy field in northern France on October 25th, 1415. The Battle of Agincourt. The story is famous. A small, exhausted, and sickly English army, led by King Henry V, was cornered by a massive French force, brimming with the pride of the French nobility. The English were trapped, and their destruction seemed certain. What followed was one of the most stunning upsets in military history. The English longbowmen, protected by a line of sharpened stakes, unleashed a storm of arrows into the charging French knights. The ground, soaked by rain, turned into a thick, clinging mud. The heavily armored French knights, weighed down by their plate, struggled to move. They were bogged down, easy targets for the English archers and men-at-arms. The first wave of the French attack was a catastrophe, and it resulted in a strange and dangerous problem for the English. They had captured an enormous number of French nobles and knights. These prisoners, who had been unhorsed and had surrendered, were worth a fortune in ransom. They were disarmed and herded to the rear of the small English army. But there were far too many of them. The prisoners may have outnumbered their English captors. It was then that a second line of the French army launched a counterattack. It was not aimed at the main English line, but at the rear, at the lightly defended English baggage train. King Henry looked at the battlefield. He saw a new attack forming on his flank, and he looked back at the huge swelling crowd of high-born prisoners. He made a desperate, terrifying calculation. He feared that the captured French nobles might see the new attack as a chance to turn the tide. He feared they could overwhelm their guards, rearm themselves with fallen weapons, and attack his exhausted army from behind. And so, King Henry gave a shocking order. An order that violated every rule of chivalry and every principle of the ransom economy. He ordered his men to kill the prisoners. Imagine the moment. He was ordering his knights to murder their fortunes, to slaughter defenseless, surrendered nobles in cold blood. It was an act of unthinkable dishonor. So unthinkable, in fact, that many of his own knights and nobles refused the order. They would not, could not, commit such a butchery against their own kind. It was a line they would not cross. Faced with this refusal, Henry was forced to assign the gruesome task to one of his squires and a contingent of some 200 archers, commoners, men who were not bound by the chivalric code and who had no financial stake in keeping the prisoners alive. They moved through the crowd of captives and carried out the slaughter. The killing of the prisoners at Agincourt was seen as a shocking stain on an otherwise glorious victory, even by contemporary chroniclers. It was a brutal act, driven by the cold, hard logic of battlefield necessity. And it is perhaps the ultimate proof of our theme. In the face of mortal danger, when survival itself was at stake, the beautiful words of the poets and the powerful allure of profit all dissolved in the mud and the blood. Pragmatism was the only code that mattered in the end. The beautiful words of chivalry often dissolved in the mud and blood of the battlefield. The code was a guideline, easily discarded for profit or survival. What do you think is the biggest myth about the knightly code? Share your quiet thoughts below. In the shadowed halls of history, we have now seen the knight in three lights. We have seen him as the brutal warrior, born of chaos. We have seen him as the calculating businessman, his fortunes built on plunder and ransom. And we have seen him as the subject of poetry, draped in a beautiful lie called chivalry, a code that so often dissolved in the harsh realities of greed and war. The chivalric ideal was a story the nobility told itself, a dream of a better man. But that dream was sustained by one inescapable fact: the military supremacy of the armored warrior on horseback. For centuries, he was the master of the battlefield. His charge was unstoppable, his position unassailable. His power on the battlefield was the justification for his power in society. But what happens when that supremacy begins to crack? What happens when the very foundation of the knight's identity is shattered, not by a better knight, but by something new? Something from below. Our story now enters its final act, the twilight of the night. An era of endings, where the warrior of 1,000 years would finally meet his match. The end of the knight's dominance did not come from a rival nobleman with a sharper lance. It came from the mud, from the forests, and from the determined hands of the very commoners he had so long oppressed. It was a slow, painful, and deeply humiliating revenge, delivered by new weapons and new ways of thinking. The first great challenge came from England, and it came in the form of a tree. The yew tree. From its wood, master bowyers crafted a weapon of terrifying power, the English longbow. This was not the simple bow of a hunter. It was as tall as a man, immensely powerful, with a draw weight that required incredible strength and years of constant practice to master. An English archer was a specialist, a professional soldier, often a free peasant or yeoman, whose entire life was dedicated to this single skill. In the hands of a trained man, the longbow could unleash a storm of arrows. A disciplined company of archers could fire 10 to 12 shots a minute. When thousands of them stood together, they could darken the sky. Their arrows, tipped with narrow, armor-piercing points called bodkins, could penetrate chainmail and find the weaker joints in plate armor. The French nobility, the epitome of chivalric, cavalry-based warfare, learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, wave after wave of French knights charged the English lines, and wave after wave, they were scythed down by the relentless blizzard of arrows. They never even reached the English lines. The flower of French chivalry was slaughtered by men they considered to be their social inferiors. The story was repeated, even more famously, at Agincourt in 1415. Again, the longbow proved its worth, turning a desperate defense into a stunning victory. The knight, in his expensive armor, was a perfect, slow-moving target for a weapon that cost a fraction of his own equipment. While the English were mastering the bow, another revolution was taking place in the mountains of Switzerland. The Swiss were fiercely independent mountain folk. They had no great love for noble lords, particularly the Habsburgs of Austria. Lacking the wealth to field large numbers of cavalry, they perfected a different method of fighting. They relied on discipline, courage, and a very long spear. They fought in dense formations, or squares, a walking hedgehog of men, bristling with 18-foot-long pikes. The front ranks would kneel, their pikes braced against the ground, creating an impenetrable wall of steel points. The ranks behind them would level their own pikes, creating a layered, multi-dimensional threat. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, a small Swiss force used the terrain to ambush and utterly annihilate a much larger Austrian army of knights. The knightly charge, the ultimate medieval weapon, shattered against the wall of pikes. The knights could not break the formation, and they were systematically dispatched. Just as the Flemish pikemen had proven at the Battle of the Golden Spurs, a disciplined body of common infantry could defeat the greatest nobles in Christendom. This was a world-turning upside-down moment. The final piece of this infantry revolution came from the Kingdom of Bohemia during the Hussite Wars of the early 15th century. The Hussites were religious reformers, considered heretics by the Catholic Church, which sent crusade after crusade of German and Hungarian knights to crush them. But the Hussites, mostly commoners and minor gentry, developed a brilliant and innovative tactical system. They used heavily built peasant carts, reinforcing them with armored plates and linking them together with chains. These formations, called a wagenburg or wagon fortress, created mobile defensive circles on the battlefield. From within the safety of their wagon fort, the Hussites used long polearms, crossbows, and crucially, a large number of early, primitive firearms. The crusading knights would charge the wagenburg, only to be met by a hail of crossbow bolts and gunfire. Their horses would shy away from the strange fortress, their charges would break, and the knights would be picked off. These developments were more than just tactical. They were psychological and social earthquakes. The knight's entire identity, his social privilege, his claim to be a higher form of human, was based on his military supremacy. What did it mean to be a noble warrior when a peasant with a longbow, a mountaineer with a pike, or a heretic in a farm cart could kill you with impunity? The lesson was clear. The age of the individual aristocratic hero was ending. The future of warfare belonged to discipline, formation, and the common man. It was a bitter pill for the nobility to swallow. If the longbow and the pike had cracked the knight's armor, gunpowder blew it to pieces. This chemical reaction, discovered in China and slowly making its way west, would be the final nail in the coffin of the armored knight. It was a revolution that rendered 1,000 years of military evolution obsolete. The first firearms were crude, clumsy, and unreliable. They were little more than iron tubes, or hand cannons, that were loaded with black powder, and a lead ball, and fired by touching a hot wire or a slow-burning match to a touch hole. They were inaccurate, took a very long time to reload, and were just as likely to misfire or explode as they were to hit their target. Yet, even in this primitive form, they had a profound psychological impact. The deafening roar, the flash of fire, the cloud of acrid, sulfurous smoke. It was terrifying to men, and more importantly, to horses. A cavalry charge could be broken simply by the noise and chaos these new weapons produced. But technology improved. By the late 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, the hand cannon had evolved into the arquebus and later the musket. These were shoulder-fired weapons with more sophisticated firing mechanisms. They were still slow to load compared to a longbow, but they had one decisive advantage. They required very little training to use. A longbowman was the product of a lifetime of practice. A knight was the product of generations of wealth and training. An arquebusier could be trained in a matter of weeks. And the lead ball he fired could punch through the finest plate armor as if it were cheese. The battlefield became a deadlier, more impersonal place. The symbolic end of the age of the bow and the true beginning of the age of cannon came at the Battle of Castellon in 1453. This was the final battle of the 100 Years' War. The English, relying on their traditional tactics, advanced on a fortified French camp. But the French had invested heavily in the new technology. Their artillery pieces opened fire, and the English army was devastated, its commanders killed. The war was over. Artillery was the new king of the battlefield. But it was another battle, 72 years later, that marked the true death of the knight himself. The Battle of Pavia in 1525. Here, an army of French forces, led by their king, faced the Spanish imperial army. The French heavy cavalry, the gendarmes, were the direct descendants of medieval knights. They were heavily armored nobles, the elite of the elite. Seeing what they thought was a moment of weakness, the French gendarmes launched a classic thunderous cavalry charge. But they were not charging onto a field of archers or spearmen. They were charging into the sights of 3,000 Spanish arquebusiers. The Spanish were professionals. They formed up and disciplined ranks. They coolly waited for the French cavalry to get close, and then they opened fire. The effect was catastrophic. The lead shot tore through the riders' expensive armor. Knights and horses were torn apart. The charge was not just stopped. It was annihilated. The elite heavy cavalry of France was systematically shot to pieces by common soldiers with gunpowder weapons. Armorers tried to respond. They made plate armor thicker, heavier, and more rounded to deflect shots. But this only made the knight more cumbersome, more ponderous. A knight in late-period armor could barely move without the help of a crane or a squire. He was a walking anvil, and eventually, no amount of steel could stop a musket ball. Gunpowder was the great equalizer. It cared nothing for your strength, your skill with a sword, your bravery, or your noble bloodline. It turned centuries of aristocratic warrior culture into a historical curiosity. The knight, the product of a millennium of social and military development, was made obsolete by a simple chemical reaction. The age of chivalry was over. The age of firepower had begun. As the knight's practical function on the battlefield faded into obsolescence, a strange thing happened. The rituals and symbols of knighthood became more elaborate, more theatrical, and more important than ever before. With his real job gone, the knight had to focus on the performance. The battlefield was replaced by the pageant field. The tournament, which had once been a rough and dangerous war game, a malley that served as real combat training, was transformed. It evolved into a highly ritualized and expensive spectator sport centered on the joust. This transformation can be seen in the armor itself. Knights began to wear incredibly elaborate and specialized armor that was designed only for the tournament. This was the German Stechug. This armor was fantastically heavy, sometimes weighing over 90 pounds. It was designed to protect a rider from a lance strike and nothing else. The helmet was bolted to the chest, making it impossible to turn one's head. The shield was fixed in place. A knight wearing this was more like a statue on horseback than a warrior. Taking it into a real battle would have been suicide. It was sporting equipment, a sign that the joust was no longer about war, but about points and public acclaim. The most ostentatious displays of this new theatrical chivalry could be found in the 15th century court of Burgundy. The Dukes of Burgundy presided over a realm of immense wealth and culture, and they used chivalric pageantry as a form of political theater. They held opulent festivals, like the famous Feast of the Pheasant in 1454. At this banquet, nobles took part in an elaborate allegory, swearing mighty oaths upon a live pheasant to go on a crusade to fight the Turks. It was a magnificent spectacle. But the crusade never happened. It was all a performance, a way to display wealth and piety without any of the messy risks of actual fighting. At the same time, monarchs across Europe began founding elite chivalric orders. The Order of the Garter in England, or the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy. These were not military units. They were exclusive clubs, the highest honor a king could bestow. Membership was granted not just to great soldiers, but to powerful political allies, to diplomats, and to relatives. The insignia of the order, a garter or a golden fleece, became a status symbol, a sign that you were in the king's inner circle. Knighthood was becoming a political tool. The tournaments themselves became more fantastical. A popular form was the pas d'armes, or passage of arms. In this event, a knight and his companions would take up a defensive position, perhaps at a bridge or a crossroads, and issue a general challenge. They would vow to defend the spot against all comers for a set number of days. Other knights would travel from miles around to take up the challenge, engaging in a series of highly choreographed and scripted jousts. It was live-action fantasy role-playing for the ultra-rich, but even this fantasy had its dangers. The death knell for the tournament as a popular aristocratic pastime rang out in 1559. During a joust celebrating a royal wedding, King Henry II of France was mortally wounded. A splinter from his opponent's shattered lance pierced the visor of his helmet and entered his eye, lodging in his brain. He died after days of agony. The tragic and somewhat freak accident horrified the courts of Europe. The sport was banned in France, and it quickly fell out of fashion elsewhere. It was a stark reminder that even in a pageant, the tools of war were still deadly. By the 16th century, the process was complete. The term knight had become little more than an honorific title. It could be purchased, or it could be awarded by a monarch to loyal administrators, to wealthy merchants, or to celebrated artists. The warrior had vanished. Only the title and the ghost of a long-dead ideal remained. Our story of the historical knight is over. The real warrior of the Middle Ages, forged in chaos, sustained by violence, and ultimately undone by time and technology, has been revealed. We have stripped away the shining armor of romance and looked upon the complex human figure beneath. He was a man of his time, a creature of necessity and ambition, as much a businessman and an enforcer as he was a hero. And yet, our work is not quite finished. For a great question remains, a question that lingers long after the historical facts have been settled, a ghost that haunts the halls of history. If the chivalrous knight of legend was a beautiful lie, why do we love it so much? Why, after centuries of deconstruction, does the myth not only survive, but thrive more powerful now than ever before? To answer this, we must leave the medieval battlefield behind. Our final chapter is an epilogue. It is a quiet, meditative journey into the nature of stories themselves. We must trace the journey of the knight's ghost through the centuries to understand how a forgotten warrior, a figure of a brutal and distant past, was rediscovered, reinvented, and ultimately reborn as an immortal dream. The myth of the noble knight did not truly die with the coming of gunpowder. It simply fell into a deep sleep. It slumbered for several centuries, through an age that had little time for what it saw as childish stories of honor and adventure. The 18th century Enlightenment, a period of reason and progress, viewed the Middle Ages with disdain, labeling it the Dark Ages due to superstition, feudalism, and religious fanaticism. Thinkers like Voltaire saw the knight as a symbol of this backward era, not a hero, but a violent, ignorant, bully humanity had thankfully moved beyond. But every age creates its own countercurrent, its own rebellion. The relentless march of reason and industry in the late 18th and early 19th centuries began to create a new kind of world. A world of factories and belching smokestacks, of sprawling, grimy cities choked with coal smoke. A world where human lives were measured by the relentless rhythm of the machine. The poet William Blake looked upon the factories of England and called them dark satanic mills. A new generation of artists, poets, and thinkers began to feel a profound sense of dislocation, of spiritual emptiness. They felt a loss of connection to the natural world, to grand passions, to a past that seemed more colorful, more authentic, and more alive. This was the birth of the Romantic movement. And the Romantics, in their desperate search for a lost golden age, fell deeply and irrevocably in love with the Middle Ages. They looked into the past and saw everything their own age lacked. They did not see a dark age of ignorance. They saw a world of profound faith. They did not see barbarism. They saw high adventure. They did not see oppression. They saw noble heroes, grand passions, and a code of honor. They looked into the past, and they built Camelot. One man, more than any other, was the master architect of this new Camelot. A Scottish lawyer and novelist with a genius for storytelling, named Sir Walter Scott. In 1820, Scott published his novel Ivanhoe. Its success was not just remarkable, it was world-changing. It was an immediate, sensational, international bestseller. The book transported readers to a 12th century England that was more myth than history. A thrilling landscape of heroic Saxon knights, dastardly Norman villains, beautiful and virtuous damsels, spectacular tournaments, and dramatic castle sieges. The hero, Wilfrid of Ivanhoe, was the perfect knight for a new age. He was brave, honorable, loyal, and driven by a pure love and a thirst for justice. Scott took the messy, complex history of Norman-Saxon relations and flattened it into a simple and satisfying story of good versus evil. He created archetypes that would endure for centuries. The noble outlaw in Lincoln Green, the beautiful and wise Jewish healer, the brooding and conflicted Knight Templar. He gave the world the knight in shining armor it had been yearning for, and the world thanked him for it. The floodgates were now open. The public was infatuated with tales of chivalry. The great poet of the Victorian era, Alfred, Lord Tennyson, answered the call, becoming the new voice of the Arthurian myth. He spent decades of his life writing his masterpiece, Idylls of the King. It was a magnificent, melancholy, and deeply moral retelling of the legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Tennyson took the raw, often strange medieval tales, and polished them into a grand Victorian allegory. His King Arthur was the perfect English gentleman, a king whose goal was to tame the beast in man and build a kingdom of light and order. Camelot became a symbol of the soul's struggle against sin and its tragic fall, a lesson on the fragility of civilization. This romantic obsession with the medieval past spilled over into every corner of the arts. In the world of painting, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood rejected the muted, classical styles of the art establishment. They created works that glowed with the jeweled intensity of a stained glass window, filled with scenes from Arthurian legend and medieval poetry. They painted knights on noble quests and beautiful, sorrowful ladies with flowing red hair, their faces filled with a tragic, romantic longing. In architecture, the Gothic revival movement sought to bring back the soaring arches, intricate stonework, and spiritual grandeur of the great medieval cathedrals. The most famous example is the Palace of Westminster in London, the home of the British Parliament, rebuilt in the Gothic style after a fire in 1834. This was a moral and political statement. Its champions believed that living and working in Gothic buildings could somehow make people more noble, more spiritual, more connected to a purer, more English past. This great romantic revival gave us the image of the knight that we still hold as our default today. But we must remember that it was a revival based on a highly selective, profoundly sanitized, and often deliberately falsified reading of history. The Romantics embraced the poetry of chivalry, but they ignored the brutal chronicles of warfare. They admired the ideals of courtly love, but overlooked the institutional violence against women and peasants. They weren't interested in the historical knight. They were in the business of creating a myth, a hero for their time. And in that, they were more successful than they could have ever dreamed. The intense romantic fascination with the Middle Ages led to a strong desire to physically experience that world. In 1839, this culminated in the Eglinton Tournament, a strange and ambitious spectacle. The event was the brainchild of Archibald Montgomery, 13th Earl of Eglinton, a wealthy and romantic Scottish nobleman. He believed Britain was in aesthetic and spiritual decline, lamenting the modest coronation of Queen Victoria, and anxious about rising democracy. Yearning for a return to a nobler, hierarchical past, he decided to host an authentic medieval tournament at his Scottish castle. It was meant to be a grand display of chivalry, defying the industrial age's materialism and embodying Sir Walter Scott's world. Preparations were immense and costly. The Earl and his friends spent fortunes commissioning replica armor and historically accurate costumes. A Queen of Beauty was chosen, banners sewn, opulent pavilions raised, and a massive grandstand built for thousands of spectators. The public was captivated. This wasn't just a private party. It became a national event. Newspapers provided daily updates, and special trains and steamships brought spectators from across the kingdom. It was a must-see event, fueled by hype and fantasy, akin to the fire festival of its era. And then the day of the tournament arrived. And so, with a sense of theatrical cruelty, did the rain. It was not a passing shower. It was a torrential, relentless Scottish downpour that began on the first day and hardly paused. The grand tournament field, the lists where the knights were to joust, turned into a quagmire, a sea of clinging, sucking mud. The great procession of knights and ladies into the lists, meant to be a vision of splendor, was a soggy, miserable affair. The ladies, shivering in their fine velvet and silk gowns, were drenched to the bone. The knights, encased in their heavy steel armor, found their magnificent war horses slipping and sliding precariously in the mire. One can only imagine the sound of a half-ton of horse and rider squelching to an undignified halt. The jousting itself, the very centerpiece of the spectacle, was a near-total fiasco. The torrential rain made the knights' lances slippery and difficult to handle. The few passes that were attempted were clumsy and comical, more slapstick than chivalry. The main event was ignominiously called off, a casualty of the weather. By any practical measure, the Eglinton tournament was an abject disaster, a rain-soaked, muddy, ruinously expensive failure. But as a cultural event, as a statement of intent, it was a stunning, unforgettable success. An estimated 100,000 people braved the abysmal weather to come and witness the spectacle. They stood for hours in the pouring rain under a forest of umbrellas just to get a glimpse of a fantasy world made real. They came to see the armor, the costumes, the pageantry, the dream. The Eglinton tournament showcased the 19th century's deep desire to live the medieval dream, solidifying the myth of the honorable, jousting knight in popular culture. Despite the poor conditions, it cemented the iconic image of the charging knight, a fantasy that felt more real than history. The romantic myth of the knight, revived by poets and acted out in a muddy field in Scotland, was about to find its most powerful and persuasive medium. In the 20th century, the knight rode out of the pages of novels and into the flickering, mesmerizing light of the cinema. Hollywood, the new dream factory, fell in love with the knight, and in doing so, broadcast his legend to every corner of the globe. The new medium of film needed heroes, and the knight was the perfect candidate. He was handsome, he was brave, in his world of towering castles, epic battles, and thrilling sword fights was visually spectacular. He was made for the silver screen. The Adventures of Robin Hood, released in 1938 and starring Errol Flynn, cemented the image of the chivalrous hero on screen. Despite being an outlaw, Flynn's portrayal of Robin Hood was athletic and witty, battling with a dazzling smile as he defended the oppressed Saxons from the tyrannical Norman knights. This optimistic hero deeply resonated with audiences during the Great Depression, offering a hopeful promise that justice would ultimately prevail. This heroic model was perfected in the grand historical epics of the 1950s and 60s. Lavish, widescreen productions like Ivanhoe, Knights of the Round Table, and El Cid brought the romantic vision of the Middle Ages to a massive baby boomer audience. These films were overwhelming spectacles of chivalry, filled with thousands of extras, thrilling cavalry charges, and heroes who embodied the highest ideals of courage, honor, and sacrifice. Then, in the 1960s, the myth took on a new and profoundly poignant layer of meaning. The Broadway musical Camelot, by Lerner and Lowe, retold the Arthurian legend, focusing on King Arthur as idealistic attempt to create a new order of chivalry where might is used for right. The show became a personal favorite of the young and dynamic President John F. Kennedy. After his shocking assassination in 1963, his widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, told Life magazine that the president especially loved the musical's finale, which referenced a brief shining moment. She famously stated there would never be another Camelot, linking King Arthur's court to the Kennedy administration's lost promise and shattered idealism. As the years went on, filmmakers began to add more grit and supposed realism to their portrayals. The armor in movies like Braveheart or Kingdom of Heaven is less polished, the battlefields are muddier, and the violence is far more brutal. Yet, even in these grittier films, the core of the romantic myth often remains. They are still, at their heart, the stories of individual heroes, men of principle and courage who stand up against corrupt and cynical systems to fight for a higher cause. The packaging may be more realistic, but the product inside is often the same heroic ideal. The archetype has proven to be incredibly durable, finding its most fertile ground in the world of pure fantasy. Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings is a perfect representation of the chivalric king, the reluctant hero who must embrace his noble destiny to save his people. The Jedi Knights of the Star Wars galaxy are spacefaring samurai with their own moral code, their mystical powers, and their laser swords. Perhaps the most interesting modern example is the television series Game of Thrones, a story which built its entire world on the familiar foundations of chivalric fantasy, only to systematically and brutally deconstruct it. It gives us characters like Brienne of Tarth, who desperately tries to live up to the purest ideals of a knight in a world that constantly punishes her for it. And it gives us characters like the cynical Jaime Lannister, who in one famous scene exposes the impossible, contradictory nature of a knight's sworn oaths. It is a story for a modern audience that knows the myth intimately and enjoys seeing it both honored and torn apart. It is a fascinating irony. For the entire century, that Hollywood was busy perfecting the image of the noble knight, making his armor shine. Ever brighter academic historians were in the dusty archives, uncovering the far more complex, brutal, and pragmatic truth of the figure we have explored in our story tonight. But the simple truth never stood a chance against such a beautiful, powerful, and endlessly adaptable lie. We arrive at last at our final and most important question. Why? After all this, after debunking the history, after exposing the violence, the greed, and the hypocrisy, why do we still need the lie? Why does the myth of the knight in shining armor hold such unshakable power over our imagination? The answer, perhaps, is that the myth fulfills a series of deep and timeless human needs. The historical knight is a creature of a specific time and place, but the mythical knight is a symbol of ideals that we desperately wish were timeless. He represents, first and foremost, our fantasy of power used correctly. In a world that is too often governed by brutality and self-interest, the knight of myth is the figure who possesses great strength, but uses it only in the service of justice. He is the warrior with a conscience. He protects the weak. He defends the innocent. He is the strong man who chooses to be a good man. This is a profoundly comforting and appealing idea, the ancestor of every superhero story we tell today. The code of chivalry, which we have seen, was so often a hollow failure in practice, endures in our minds as an aspirational moral compass. Its tenets are, on the surface, beautifully simple. Be brave, be loyal, keep your promises, show mercy, speak the truth, defend the helpless. In our own complex and often morally gray world, where right and wrong can seem hopelessly tangled, the simple clarity of the knight's code offers a sense of direction. It is a story about how to be a good person, distilled into its most heroic and romantic form. The archetype also speaks to our powerful belief in the importance of the individual. The knight is the one brave person who can make a difference. In a world of vast, impersonal systems of governance, corporations, and armies where individuals can feel small and powerless, the knight represents the fantasy that one person's courage can still matter. He is the one who will ride out to face the dragon when everyone else is hiding. He is the one who will stand on the castle walls against impossible odds. He is the champion of individual agency against overwhelming forces. Ultimately, our enduring fascination with the knight probably tells us far more about ourselves than it does about the actual Middle Ages. Our love for the myth reveals our own values, our own longings, our own deep-seated anxieties. We use the knight as a mirror to examine our own ideals of honor, justice, and sacrifice. The knight in shining armor is an empty vessel into which we pour our own highest aspirations for humanity. We need the knight because we need to believe in heroism. We need to believe in moral clarity. And we need to believe that strength and goodness are not, in the end, mutually exclusive. The story of the knight is a tale of two truths. There is the truth of history, a story written in ledgers and chronicles, in blood and ambition. And there is the truth of myth, a story written in poetry and longing, in hope and imagination. Perhaps we need both. The history to keep us grounded in the complex, difficult, and often disappointing reality of the human experience. And the myth to give us a star to navigate by, an ideal to strive for, a dream of what we could be at our very best. The true knight may be a lie, but the ideal he represents continues to inspire. And now there are no more truths to uncover, no more myths to explore. There is only the quiet of the night. Let the story end, and let your rest begin. Sleep well.